Okay, so the German name for this attack on the Kursk salient was Operation Citadel, and so basically the German generals got a sense, they could see from their own reconnaissance that the Soviets were prepared for the attack on the Kursk salient. Even looking at a map, it was an obvious place for Hitler to attack because he could attack it from both the north and the south. And they could see the fortifications that the Soviet army was creating throughout the spring and early summer of 1943. And they urged Hitler to abandon this offensive, but that wasn't Hitler's style. Once he had decided on a mode of action, this was Hitler being Hitler. He said he was going to see it through regardless. And now the original start date of Operation Citadel was May 3rd. But Hitler did something stupid, which once again, he makes a mistake. He chose to wait for better weather, which probably actually wasn't that bad a mistake because in the spring in the Soviet Union, the roads, which were pretty terrible, get very, very muddy. So that probably wasn't a big mistake. But he was also waiting for his new state-of-the-art Panzer and Panther and Tiger tanks, even though they had never been field tested. Hitler was a big believer in the technology of Nazi Germany, that these miracle machines would lead the Nazis to victory. And these new tanks, the Panther tank and the Tiger tank, they were excellent tanks. They were quite devastating. But the problem was is that they were so high end, they tended to break down. And as I just said, they had never been field tested in battle. And this is where you get a difference in philosophy between Hitler, who's always looking for these new weapons that will save the day for him, and Stalin, who is he's very happy with just the tried and true Soviet tanks. And one of his most famous quotes from World War II is quantity is quality. Quantity is quality. So the Soviet tanks weren't as good one on one as these new German tanks, but Stalin by 1943, because he'd moved the production facilities to the east, he's able to produce tanks, as many tanks as he needs. So it's not a problem for him. For Stalin, the philosophy was, I'll make so many tanks that it won't matter that the German tanks are better than ours, and the German tanks tended to break down anyway. So the Soviets keep on working, keep on creating defensive lines as the German army delays the attack on the Kursk salient. And again, the unsung heroes of this are the civilians in this area. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of civilians that dug a vast network of trenches that extended in total 2,500 miles. And so the Blitzkrieg, what they hoped to do in attacking the Soviet position and attacking the Soviet bulge, was they hoped to create an element of surprise. But of course, they hadn't. By the time that the attack begins on July 5th, 1943, the Russians had complete understanding of what the Germans were up to, even to the point that as the Germans were preparing for an attack on July 5th, the Soviets actually opened up their artillery fire first. It didn't make a big difference in the overall battle, but it was kind of like a little psychological gamesmanship. And so what you had is that you had an attack, and you can see it a little bit on this map, and I'll post an animated map. You had an attack on the Kursk salient from the north and the south. The attack on the south was more successful. than the North, but it failed to penetrate the Soviet defensive in any kind of disastrous way. And the Red Army suffered huge losses, but it still prevented the Germans from closing the bulge and from capturing the city of Kursk. And then something happens, which is very interesting. On July 10th, 1943, Allied troops landed on the beach in Sicily. And this played a profound role in Hitler's thinking. He rerouted some of the panzer divisions to Italy that were headed towards the Soviet Union. So this kind of gets to this question that we've had in the class about the significance of the Italian campaign. But there does not seem to be any doubt that the Allied landing in Sicily helped blunt the German offensive at Kursk, because Hitler, instead of sending some of his newest tanks to the Soviet Union, he diverts them over to Italy to create the Sicily to create to fight the Allied invasion in this area. So in this respect, the landings in Sicily and Italy did a big favor for Stalin and the Soviet Union. So the Soviets, for their part, launched a counteroffensive on July 12th. And by late July of 1943, the Soviets had the Germans on the run, and they had pushed the German army back to the original starting point of Operation Citadel. So, long story short, Operation Citadel, this attempt to capture this enormous bulge in the Soviet lines and to annihilate the Soviet army and to give the Germans new, fresh energy in the southern part of the Soviet Union was a failure. And so the Battle of Kursk marks the end of Hitler's dream of conquering Russia. The Germans were able to make some inroads into the Kursk salient, but ultimately they were defeated. And the Germans are on the defensive for the rest of the war. This is the last great German offensive in the summer of 1943, and they're on the defensive after their defeat of Kursk. Now, a lot of folks are going to die. A lot of soldiers are going to die between July of 45 and April of, I'm sorry, July 43 and April 45. So still a lot of fighting left, including an operation I'm going to talk about in my next podcast. But you can mark here at Kursk, the Germans from that point on, no more offensive operations. They're moving backward. They're being forced back, and they're fighting quite desperately as the Soviet army is gaining strength. The Soviets suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, perhaps 800,000 Soviet casualties compared to 200,000 German casualties. We don't really know for sure, but the Soviet Union suffered far more casualties than the Germans did. But the German, tactically and strategically, Kursk was a failure, even though the German army suffered fewer casualties than the Russian army. And so after Kursk, the Germans never regained any kind of offensive momentum in the Soviet Union, and the rest of the war, they're fighting a desperate defensive action.